For me, Ifra's curatorial framework was a reminder of a shared responsibility that does not stop at questions of representation or visibility. It pointed towards more uncomfortable, the loops, the repetitions, the leftovers of ideology that are still moving through my body, my materials, my habits. I became less interested in speaking about systems in the safe, abstract way many of us are trained to do. It is easy to point at large, distant powers, history, structures, institutions, and to ignore the questions of what we are personally maintaining through our own practice. We know how to produce critical language. We also know how easily it can be a shield. With Realities Radical, I decided to make my own participation the starting point. My choices, my access, my blind spots, the invitation I receive, the roles I'm asked to perform, and the roles I have learned to perform very well. The aim is not to deliver a clean message. If anything, I hope this work leaves both me and you with more questions than answers. Not confusion for its own sake, but to make more room to notice what we usually rush past. Two sentences have held the project together. The first is the title, Realities Radical. I borrowed the phrase from Michael Parenti, but I use it as a working instruction rather than a slogan. It suggests that if we come close enough to a reality we already live inside, it stops looking neutral. Everyday arrangements of work, care, housing, and time, it's already charged with exhaustion and inequality, but also with obligation and possibility. We do not need to decorate reality with radical images. We need to let those arrangements be seen more clearly. In this context, reality does not mean a rejection of imagination. The second sentence is by Frederick Jameson. History is what hurts. It refuses desire and sets inexorable limits to individual as well as collective praxis. Where Parenti reminds us that reality is already full of pressure, if we come close to it, Jameson insists that this reality is not endlessly flexible. There are limits we collide with, limits shaped by previous struggles, failed projects, inherited structures, and those collisions are what he calls hurt. The point where our wishes and our narratives of change meet something that does not move just because we want it to. The tension between these two sentences is the core of the project. Reality is already mapped out. History sets limits. The work is to step closer to something, to both without romanticizing either. At the same time, I didn't want to dissolve everything into ambiguity. When I speak about loops, betrayal, and postponement, it is not because I enjoy uncertainty, it is because I still believe we need some shared ground, a minimum of structure, clarity, even common sense, if we are going to think or act together at all. I'm not interested in moralizing or endless condemnation. What matters to me is clarity that makes responsibility harder to dodge. This is where Vivek Chibir has been important to me, or for me. He is very blunt in pointing out that culture, discourse, and representations cannot carry more weight than the basic organizations of social life. Cultural production, it might sharpen our language, but it does not on its own rearrange the condition we live under. There is a danger, he says, that we confuse interpretive clarity with real change, that we start to believe if we just describe our situation in every more refined terms, The situation itself will somehow shift. His insistence on a kind of grounded rationality, on the fact that people everywhere respond to pressure, interest, and necessity, has pushed me to look past the endless play of meanings. Xian has been another anchor here. In her writings on contradictions, she describes how large parts of contemporary theory move away from science, from any claim how the world actually works. Instead, we cultivate a style of thoughts that mistrust explanation, mistrust cause and effect, mistrust clarity itself. The result is not liberation from rigid thinking, but a fog in which everything is declared complex, while the concrete mechanisms and responsibilities remain unnamed. She sees these not as depth, but as a failure of courage. If we abandon the effort to understand the world in a systematic way, we also abandon the possibility of transforming it. So we end up producing even more sophisticated confusion. Pauline Hontonji, he adds another layer. In his critique of ethnophilosophy, he shows how culture and tradition are often treated as a ready-made truth, built from fragments, proverbs, rituals, myths, stitched together and presented as a single, unified worldview. The gesture is familiar to me. Fragments of minority experiences can also be arranged to produce a sense of wholeness, an origin, even a cultural essence. For Hontonji, the fact that something is archived, documented, or labeled tradition, it does not make it truer or closer to reality. It is still a construction. He's particularly critical of the idea that science and philosophy belongs elsewhere, that they are someone else's tools and therefore must be refused in the name of our own heritage. So against this, he argues for a kind of critical universalism, science and philosophy as a part of a shared human toolkit, methods for testing claims, tracing causes, revising assumption. In his view, is sort of to give up a crucial instrument for understanding and even changing the world. Taken together, these three thinkers pull me in the same direction. They push me against a certain romanticism of discourses, culture and tradition, and they insist on our capacity and our obligation to think clearly. They remind me that confident, radical-sounding statements are not the same as understanding, and that respect for heritage or difference can easily become an excuse for avoiding analysis. For this project, their work has functioned as a kind of discipline, a pressure not to hide behind beautifully layered ambiguity or language, but to ask again and again what actually changes and what simply gets renamed. This pressure towards clarity falls back into something very concrete in my own life. For a long time, I related to my life here in Norway as something temporary, almost like a transit lounge. Looking back, this is what it was, a waiting room. I kept rehearsing myself somewhere else, another country, another future, another narrative, where my story will finally make sense. That fantasy stopped feeling poetic, and it started to feel like more a problem. The project forced a very simple and uncomfortable recognition. I'm actually here in this country, here in this city, here at the Veitam. In this particular block, at this particular time, and if I'm here, the question is no longer where is my real life, but what am I doing with the life I already have? My fixation of the past, family history, lost futures, political failures have also been a way to shield myself from the present. If I stay busy with archives and the search for origins, maybe I don't have to even engage fully with the ordinary demands of my everyday reality. Realizing that I had been in this temporary guest mode, it was really hard. Almost for 25 years, it felt almost physical. Once you admit that, you begin to see the ruins you already live in. I'm sorry. The ruins you already live in, with the consequences that will not vanish. Gaps between generations, unshared reality in one family. My parents' disappointment is so heavy that they have taken refuge in a strong idea of the afterlife. This life is only a corridor. Real justice will come later, after death. For a long time, I read that only as a refusal to take responsibility for the present time, which I still believe partially true, but they escaped into heaven and I escaped into elsewhere. Imagined futures, imagined cities, imagined versions of myself. Their corridor was religious and mine was sort of political and aesthetic. So both of us postponed reality. At that point, Tveita entered this project in a new way. The photographs of the blocks, the sunsets, and the sky from our apartment are not about discovering an authentic place. They are just the basic instructions, again, to me to stand inside my own life. Look at where you are, where you actually live, at the architectures that holds you, the weather that passes your windows, the bodies and routines that shares this space with you. This is a concrete node inside a larger field you do not control but still belong to. The present slips through our fingers. What we call now often arrives first as an after image, a moment that has already passed. For me, the Tveita images are about that delay, the moment sliding into noise, routine, memory. This is where Jameson's sentences started to make even more sense for me. History is not just a backdrop. It is already inscribed in how I see this place, in which possibilities I register or ignore. Taking Tveita seriously as a place, as a present time, became a way of taking my own reality seriously. At the same time, the sunset is not an innocent image. Here, the very concrete sky over Tveita meets a far more familiar figure. The postcard sunset, or sometimes I call them like Mama Africa sunsets. One of our most overused pictures. The sky on fire, the horizon glowing, everything dipped in warm light. These images circulate as a small promises of escape and repair. Scenes where contradiction seems loosened and days end cleanly. Somewhere else, under a better sky. I'm interested in that promise, just before it breaks. The sunset's image is seductive because it briefly suspends conflict, letting us believe that history, exhaustion, and damage are quietly moving towards resolution. In this project, letting the most cliched sunsets run in parallel against Tveita's very concrete skies is a way of staging that tension between the flat, reassuring image of an elsewhere and then the more complicated, unfinished reality we actually inhabit. concerned with exposing the cliché than with staying inside the feeling it offers. The temporary glow, just before the light drops and we are returned to everything that is still unresolved. The other field where these questions crystallized for me was the archive. For many years, I used my practice to trace and make sense of inherited losses. Fragments of knowledge, undocumented events, music, photographies, scattered memories from my childhood in Ethiopia and also in Norway. Those fragments were never stable. They were told and retold through selective memory, shaped by survival, belief, pressure, and silence. The more I worked in this way, the harder it became to maintain the fantasy of repair. I realized that I was not collecting the past itself, but I was just mapping the conditions that made remembering too difficult, or so difficult. The archival impulses remains necessary, but it can also become a loop. The archive is a resource and it is a trap. It can turn into a place where the wound is carefully preserved, framed, and repeated until the repetition itself becomes a kind of comfort. We keep returning to what was taken rather than asking how we are living now. We keep returning to what was taken rather than asking how we are living now. In that sense, the archives become also a system that continuously reaffirms the lack. This is where Andaye becomes crucial for me. She changes the grammar of critique. Instead of asking who betrayed the revolution, she asks how we organize that betrayal ourselves. Failure is not a rare scandal at the end of the story. It is built into the way authority is produced, and care is neglected from the beginning. Movements do not only fall to an external enemy. They also rot from within. When reproducing status, funding, and prestige takes the place of responsibility. In Andaye's account, radical projects are slowly folding back into management and professionalized service work. The vocabulary remains rights and empowerment, but in practice it helps maintain the same order that produced that injustice or the injustice. History is not only violence from outside, it is the sentiment of choices made inside a project. Loyalties, exclusions, avoidance that harden into limits for the next generation. And I grew up in that atmosphere, in a house where the past was everywhere and nowhere at once. For Jameson, this is what hurt names. Not one failure behind, but unresolved history lodged in the body, in the hesitation, in the blind spots of thoughts. But whether we can interrupt the patterns that make it predictable. You know, the quiet misuse of power wrapped in a radical slogans. My task is not to complete my parents' revolution in symbolic form, nor to turn their hurt into aesthetic capital. It is to read the ruins they left, the silence, the exhaustion, the narrow now they inhabit as a part of the history that sets limits for me, and then decide which part of it I refuse to repeat. These questions are not only theoretical for me, they cut through into the aesthetic field I work inside. The worlds of art, design, and theory are very good at generating critical language. We know how to stage distance, irony, reflexivity. We know how to perform resistance, but here again, I find myself returning to thinkers who are skeptical of what this performance actually does. He argues that the cultural field is not a separate heroic space standing outside of power. It is woven into the same arrangement of funding, prestige, and institutional interest as everything else. According to him, critical art can function as an internal safety mechanism. It is a place where critical voices are displayed, curated, and managed so that the basic organizations of society does not have to change. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a very straightforward description of how culture is integrated into the existing order. For me, his work punctures that fantasy that radical aesthetics are radical by default. Jennifer, she adds in a different but related way. She writes about how aesthetic forms can both open and close political imagination. On the one hand, images, performances, and narratives, they can really help us, sense the possibilities that are not yet fully thinkable. On the other hand, they can be carefully channeled, turned into, again, recognizable critical styles that circulate smoothly through institutions without disturbing anything fundamental. A certain kind of darkness, a certain kind of ruin, a certain kind of trauma can become a currency, a way of signaling depth that is already anticipated and observed. This project pushed me to ask harder questions about my own positions and aesthetic choices, the form, tones, and images I rely on, and the objects I make, in the serious theoretical informed voice I'm using right now. I keep asking, am I actually interrupting anything, or am I feeding into a familiar, already recognizable genre of critical art? In other words, where does my work risk becoming just another layer of ideological packaging? A carefully crafted surface that wraps and quietly protects the very relations it appears to question. In this project, I made a very conscious decision not to press the theoretical frame into every object in the room. Because early, especially with my background, like earlier in my design background, I often felt obliged to translate theory into something practical, to make the physical work, carry it, to turn each material choices into a readable reference. Here, I wanted the theory to stand alongside the work instead of being squeezed into it. The works you see in the exhibition grew out of what was actually possible. Budget, skills, production space, time, and also my own taste. They came from intuitive decisions that are not random, but shaped by experience through failing, testing, adjusting, taking risk. The theoretical frame comes to life in the thoughts, feelings, and how I approach my work, and how I read and also misread Andaye, Rokel, Hontonji, Parenti, Jameson. I'm not requiring, us all to decode a philosophical diagram, but I do insist that theory combined with praxis or into practice will sharpen our eyes, how we decide without turning what we produce into illustration. With some distances between them, and I think that distance is necessary. This does not mean abandoning aesthetics or rejecting institution in a purist act. It just means, treating the aesthetic field itself as a site of struggle and ambiguity, not as a guaranteed space for resistance. It means recognizing that form, tone, and style are not neutral. They can either thicken the fog or help cut through it a little. This brings me to one last figure that has been important for this project: the ruin. A ruin is neither fully past nor fully present. It marks the point where a construction has collapsed, but it is a structure, it's still standing. It carries traces not as a closed history, but as a continuing presence. It shows that collapse is not the same as disappearance. Something remains and it keeps insisting on being seen. I started to treat the ruin as a method. Whenever promises fail, they leave something behind. Institutions that have outlived their purposes, rituals going through the motions without leave, and forms of speech that no longer fit the experiences they are supposed to carry. The easy move is to romanticize these remains, to let them feed a soft melancholy. But we can also read them more directly against the smooth stories that prefer continuity over visible breaks. Ideological projects leaves ruins as well. If we never examine them, they harden into habits. Default way of thinking and reacting that the next generation inherits as if they were new. The loops continue. Here, collapse becomes a useful word. The moment when the distance between life and narrative becomes too wide for the structures to hold. A collective falls apart. The ruin is the visible face of the moment. It says, this was once a promise, now it is something else. What will you do with this something else? The question turns back to my own practice. How can I live with what remains without turning it into a relic? This project is in many ways an attempt to stay with the unfinished, to move among remnants of disillusions, promises, and unexamined inheritance without converting them into emotional currency. And to ask instead, what kinds of practice and responsibilities are still possible in the aftermath?